A lonely widow saves a dying puppy on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, never realizing it will later lead her to her soulmate. This is how fate works sometimes, through the smallest acts of kindness, through moments we think insignificant, through the gentle stirring of compassion when we're at our lowest. Margaret Wilson hadn't truly smiled in 872 days, not since Robert's funeral. Not since the chairs were folded and put away, the casseroles stopped arriving, and the phone calls dwindled to nothing but occasional wrong numbers and sales pitches. Grief had settled into her bones like the persistent damp of winter, familiar, heavy, and seemingly permanent. The cottage on Mulberry Lane was too large for one person. Everyone said so. Her sister had suggested selling it 6 months after the funeral. The realtor had called it charming but spacious, in a voice that really meant too much house for a widow your age. But how could she leave the garden where Robert had planted rose bushes for their 30th anniversary? Or the kitchen where they'd danced barefoot after their children's graduation? Or the bedroom where she still kept his reading glasses on the nightstand, unable to tuck them away into some drawer where memories go to fade? Each morning, Margaret rose at precisely 6:15, made tea in the blue ceramic pot Robert had brought back from their trip to England, and sat in the bay window watching the neighborhood come to life. Sometimes she opened a book, but mostly she just held it, finding more solace in its weight than its words. That Tuesday morning, the rain fell in sheets, transforming the world outside into a watercolor painting of grays and muted greens. Margaret wrapped her cardigan, Robert's cardigan really, still carrying the faintest trace of his aftershave, more tightly around her slender frame. She was thinner now. Grief had whittled away at her once soft curves until her clothes hung from her body like they belonged to someone else. The sound was so faint she nearly missed it, a whimper, barely audible above the drumming rain. Margaret tilted her head, listening. There it was again, a small, desperate sound that tugged at something deep within her chest. Setting down her teacup with trembling hands, she moved to the front door. The porch boards creaked beneath her slippered feet as she peered out into the drizzle. At first, she saw nothing. Then, a slight movement caught her eye. A shivering bundle of matted fur huddled against her garden gate. Margaret didn't think. For the first time in 872 days, she acted purely on instinct. She stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, her heart suddenly beating a rhythm she had forgotten it knew. The rain soaked through her thin nightgown and cardigan, plastering silver hair to her forehead as she hurried down the garden path. The puppy was little more than bones and wet fur, its eyes crusted shut, its breathing shallow and labored. When Margaret's hands, cold from the rain but somehow alive with purpose, scooped under its tiny body, it didn't resist. It merely shuddered, as if it had been waiting for these exact hands to find it. "Oh, you poor little thing," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. When was the last time she had spoken aloud in her empty house? "It's all right now. It's all right." But looking down at the pitiful creature cradled against her chest, Margaret wasn't sure if anything would ever be all right again. The puppy looked moments from death, ribs protruding sharply through mud-caked fur, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. Inside, Margaret moved with a decisiveness that surprised her. She grabbed a soft towel from the linen closet, ignoring how it was part of the set Robert had insisted was too good for everyday use. She cleared a space on the kitchen counter, laying the puppy gently on the towel. "Stay with me," she murmured, her voice catching. "Please stay with me." The puppy's eyes remained closed, but Margaret felt a faint heartbeat beneath her fingertips. She reached for her phone, fumbling with the unfamiliar screen. When was the last time she'd made a call? And dialed the veterinarian in town. "Doctor? Klein's office," a cheerful voice answered. I found a puppy," Margaret said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "It's dying, I think." "Please?" To her surprise, the voice on the other end softened immediately. "Bring it in right away, Mrs. Wilson." "We'll be waiting." "Mrs. Wilson." The receptionist knew her. Of course she did. Small towns had long memories. Margaret had taken Robert's golden retriever, Old Ben, to Dr. Klein until he passed 3 years before Robert. She hadn't been back since. Margaret wrapped the puppy carefully in the towel, grabbed her purse, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, left her house without checking 3 times that the stove was off or the windows locked. Some things, she realized as she backed her seldom-used car out of the garage, were more important than ritual. The veterinary clinic was only 10 minutes away, but every second stretched painfully as Margaret drove through the rain-washed streets. The puppy made no sound in the towel bundle beside her on the passenger seat, the seat where Robert used to sit, where he would rest his hand on her knee at red lights. "Almost there," she kept saying, unsure if she was reassuring the puppy or herself. "Just hold on." The clinic's lights were bright and harsh after the soft gray of the rainy morning. As promised, they were waiting for her, Dr. Klein himself holding the door, his kind face creased with concern. "Margaret," he said simply, and in that one word was acknowledgement of everything: her loss, her absence from the world, and her unexpected return. He reached for the bundle in her arms. "Let me see." Margaret hesitated, suddenly reluctant to let go. Her arms tightened protectively around the small body. "I found it by my gate," she explained, her voice unsteady. "I don't know how long it was there or where it came from." "Doctor," Klein nodded, gently taking the bundle. "You did the right thing bringing it in. Let's see what we can do." What followed was a blur of activity, the small examining room filled with efficient movement as Dr. Klein and his assistant worked over the tiny patient. Words floated around Margaret: severe dehydration, malnourished, possible fracture, infection. She sank into a chair in the corner, her wet clothes clinging uncomfortably, but she barely noticed. "Can you save it?" she finally asked during a lull, her voice barely audible. "Doctor." Klein straightened, meeting her eyes directly. "It's touch and go, Margaret. The next 24 hours will tell." "She's a fighter, though. This little girl has survived longer than she should have already." A little girl. Somehow this detail made the puppy more real to Margaret, less a bundle of fur, and more a living being with a future that hung in the balance. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the steadiness that had returned to her voice. "We'll keep her here, get her stabilized if we can. IV fluids, antibiotics, warmth." Dr. Klein hesitated. "Do you want us to call you with updates, or—" The unspoken question hung between them. Was Margaret taking responsibility for this creature, or had her duty ended with the rescue? Margaret looked at the tiny puppy, now connected to tubes and monitors that made her seem even smaller. Something stirred in her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it. Hope. It was hope, fragile and terrifying. "I'll come back," she said firmly. "This afternoon? And tomorrow? For as long as she needs." Dr. Klein's smile was gentle. "She'll need a name, you know, for the paperwork." Margaret hadn't thought that far ahead. Names were important. They made things real, created attachment. Did she want attachment? Did she deserve it? The puppy's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, fighting for each one. "Grace," Margaret said softly. "Her name is Grace." On the drive home, Margaret's house key felt strange in her hand. The cottage seemed different somehow, less like a museum of memories and more like a place she merely lived. She moved through the familiar rooms, suddenly seeing them with new eyes. The empty spaces, the silence. She changed out of her wet clothes, made a fresh cup of tea, and sat at her kitchen table. For the first time in months, she didn't sit in Robert's chair but in her own. And for the first time in 872 days, she made a list. Things Grace will need if she survives. 1. Dog bed 2. Food and water bowls 3. Puppy food, ask doctor. Klein what kind 4. Collar and leash 5. Toys. She stared at the list, her handwriting looking unfamiliar after so long without writing anything more than her signature on bills. The "if" in the title bothered her. With a decisive stroke, she crossed it out and wrote "when" above it. At exactly 2:30, Margaret returned to the clinic. "Doctor." Klein looked surprised to see her so soon. "Any change?" she asked, clutching her purse strap tightly. "She's holding her own," he said cautiously. "That's a good sign. Would you like to see her?" Grace was in a warming incubator, looking impossibly fragile, but her breathing seemed stronger, and when Margaret placed her hand against the clear plastic, the puppy's ear twitched slightly. "Talk to her." "Doctor," Klein encouraged. "Animals respond to voices." Margaret cleared her throat, feeling foolish. What did one say to a dying puppy? She hadn't carried on a conversation with anyone in so long. "Hello, Grace," she began uncertainly. "I'm Margaret. I found you this morning, though I suppose you know that part." The puppy's ear twitched again. "I don't know much about dogs," Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier. "Robert, my husband, he was the dog person. He would know exactly what to do with you." What to say? To her horror, Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't cried in months. Not since the first anniversary of Robert's death, when she'd finally packed away his toothbrush. "But I'm going to try," she whispered fiercely. "I'm going to try for both of us. So you have to fight, Grace. You have to stay." "Doctor!" Klein touched her shoulder gently. "You can come back tomorrow morning. We'll call if there's any change overnight." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the tiny puppy fighting for breath. Around midnight, she got up and went to the spare bedroom closet where she'd stored the last of Robert's things that she couldn't bear to give away. In a box at the back was old Ben's dog bed, his leash, and a few toys that had survived his enthusiastic chewing. Margaret ran her fingers over the worn fabric of the bed, remembering how Robert had insisted on buying only the best for his canine companion. She pulled the items out one by one, setting them on the living room floor. The house didn't feel quite so empty with these objects taking up space. "What do you think, Robert?" she whispered to the quiet room. "Am I being foolish?" No answer came, of course. But as she clutched old Ben's leash to her chest, Margaret felt something like permission settle over her. The call came at 6:13 a.m., just as Margaret was making her morning tea. She made it through the night. "Doctor," Klein said without preamble. "And she took a little broth from a dropper about an hour ago." Margaret's knees weakened, and she gripped the counter for support. "She's going to be all right? Not out of the woods yet." "Doctor," Klein cautioned, "but puppies are remarkably resilient. If you still want to come in today, I'll be there at 8, Margaret said firmly. For the next week, Margaret's life revolved around 2-hour visits to the veterinary clinic. Grace grew stronger each day, first lifting her head when Margaret spoke, then wagging her tail weakly, and finally, on the 6th day, licking Margaret's finger when she was allowed to place her hand inside the incubator. "What kind of dog is she?" Margaret asked as she watched Grace take tentative steps around a small pen Dr. Klein had set up. "Hard to say for certain at this age, but my guess is she's part terrier, part who knows what. She'll be small to medium-sized, I think." He smiled. "The perfect size for your cottage." Margaret looked up sharply. She hadn't formally decided to keep Grace, had she? But watching the puppy explore on wobbly legs, her little face bright with curiosity despite all she'd been through, Margaret knew there was no other option. "When can I take her home?" she asked. 2 days later, Margaret Wilson walked through her front door with a small dog carrier and a bag of supplies. For the first time in years, she wasn't entering an empty house. Grace's early days at the cottage were a careful dance of learning and adaptation. Margaret adjusted to the puppy's schedule, the middle-of-the-night trips outside, the careful feeding of special recovery food, the administering of medications. Grace adjusted to having a home, sometimes startling at shadows or cowering at sudden movements, suggesting her early weeks had not been kind. They healed each other in small, imperceptible ways. Margaret started talking again, at first just to Grace, explaining household objects or narrating her daily routines, but then to herself, working through decisions aloud in a way she hadn't since Robert died, and finally, hesitantly, to others, exchanging more than polite nods with the mail carrier, actually conversing with the grocery clerk, stopping to chat with neighbors who cooed over the puppy on their walks. The walks themselves were revelatory. Margaret had forgotten how many shades of green existed in the world, how many different bird songs filled the morning air, how the light changed subtly throughout the day. With Grace trotting beside her, growing stronger and more confident each week, Margaret began to see her small town again, not as a blur through a car window on necessary errands, but as a living community. 3 months after that rainy Tuesday, Grace was unrecognizable from the dying creature Margaret had found. Her coat, revealed to be a warm golden brown once the dirt and matting were gone, gleamed with health. Her eyes, which Dr. Klein had feared might be damaged from infection, shone bright and alert. She had quirks and preferences, a favorite spot on the sofa, a particular squeak toy she carried to bed each night, an enthusiastic greeting routine whenever Margaret returned from even the briefest absence. One Saturday morning in early summer, Margaret sat in the garden watching Grace chase butterflies through the rose bushes. The roses themselves were blooming magnificently, better than they had in years, perhaps because Margaret had finally started tending them again. "She looks happy," a voice said, startling Margaret from her reverie. Margaret turned to see her neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, peering over the garden fence. In the past, Margaret might have offered a tight smile and retreated indoors. Today, she found herself gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Would you like some iced tea, Helen? I just made a fresh pitcher." The look of surprise on Mrs. Abernathy's face was almost comical, but she quickly recovered. "That would be lovely, Margaret. Thank you." As Margaret went inside to fetch the tea, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. This Margaret had color in her cheeks, had recently cut hair, wore a summery dress instead of Robert's old cardigan. This Margaret looked alive. The realization should have brought guilt. Wasn't it a betrayal of Robert's memory to keep living while he couldn't? But instead, Margaret felt a gentle certainty that this was exactly what he would have wanted for her. She returned with the tea to find Mrs. Abernathy throwing a ball for an ecstatic Grace. "She's such a dear little thing," Mrs. Abernathy said, accepting the glass. "You know, the community center is hosting a pet adoption event next weekend. They're always looking for volunteers to help, especially people with success stories like yours." Margaret's instinct was to refuse immediately. Volunteering meant people, conversations, stepping further into the world. But before she could say no, Grace bounded up, dropping the ball at her feet and looking up with those trusting eyes. "I'll think about it," Margaret heard herself say. The pet adoption event was held in the community center's large meeting room, transformed for the day with pens for adoptable animals, information booths, and a small stage for announcements. Margaret arrived early, Grace on her leash, feeling out of place and fighting the urge to turn around and go home. "You must be Margaret." A tall man with salt and pepper hair approached, hand extended. "Helen Abernathy told me you might be coming. I'm Daniel Porter, the event coordinator." His handshake was warm and firm, his smile reaching all the way to crinkled eyes. Margaret noticed he wore a wedding band on his right hand rather than his left. Widower, her mind registered automatically. "This must be the famous Grace," Daniel continued, kneeling to let the puppy sniff his hand. "Helen told me about her remarkable recovery. Would you be willing to say a few words during our presentation? Success stories really help encourage adoptions." Margaret's heart raced at the thought of speaking publicly. "I'm not sure I'd be very good at that." Daniel's smile was kind. "Just a minute or two, sharing how this little one changed your life. No pressure, though. Either way, we're glad you're here. Why don't I show you around?" Throughout the morning, Margaret found herself sharing Grace's story again and again, with prospective adopters, with other volunteers, with children who wanted to pet the friendly puppy. Each telling became easier, the words flowing more naturally. During a quiet moment, Daniel appeared at her side with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," he said, offering one to her. "You're a natural, you know. 3 of the families you spoke with have already put in adoption applications." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully. "It's Grace who's the natural. She makes it easy to talk about her. Sometimes we need something or someone to help us find our voice again," Daniel said quietly. There was understanding in his gaze that made Margaret wonder how much Helen had told him about her circumstances. Before she could respond, they were called to help with a family meeting a particularly energetic Labrador puppy. The moment passed, but throughout the day, Margaret found herself working alongside Daniel repeatedly, helping an elderly man find a senior cat that would be good company, assisting a young family with paperwork for a 3-legged shepherd mix, taking turns walking dogs that needed breaks from the busy room. By late afternoon, when the event was winding down, Margaret realized she hadn't checked her watch once, hadn't looked for excuses to leave early, hadn't felt the familiar tightness in her chest that social situations usually brought. "I think we can call today a success," Daniel said as they helped pack up the last of the supplies. 17 adoptions plus 6 pending home checks. Not bad for a small-town event. "It was nice," Margaret admitted. "I'm glad I came." Daniel hesitated, then said, "Some of us volunteers usually grab dinner at Marino's after these events. Nothing fancy, just pizza and conversation. You'd be welcome to join us." Grace, too. Joe Marino lets dogs on the back patio. The invitation caught Margaret off guard. Dinner with strangers. Conversation. It should have terrified her. A year ago, even 3 months ago, she would have declined immediately. But today, the thought didn't seem so daunting. "I'd like that," she said, surprised to find she meant it. Marino's was a small Italian restaurant on Main Street with checked tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. The back patio was strung with fairy lights that glowed softly in the early evening. Grace settled contentedly under the table with a chew toy, occasionally accepting gentle pats from passing servers. The group was small, just Daniel, an enthusiastic college student named Tara, a retired couple, and Margaret. The conversation flowed easily, centered at first around the day's successes and the animals still needing homes, then branching into other topics. Margaret found herself laughing at Daniel's story about a Great Dane who had been returned to the shelter for being too small, when he only grew to the size of a Labrador. When was the last time she had laughed like this? She couldn't remember. As the evening progressed, the others gradually departed until only Margaret and Daniel remained, nursing cups of coffee as the stars appeared above the patio. "I should be getting Grace home," Margaret said reluctantly, noticing the puppy had fallen asleep under her chair. Daniel nodded. "Of course. I've kept you too long." "No," Margaret said quickly. "It's been wonderful, actually. Thank you for inviting me." Daniel walked her to her car, waiting as she gently placed a sleepy Grace in the back seat. In the glow of the street lamp, Margaret could see the kindness in his face, the gentle humor in his eyes. "We're holding another event next month," he said. "Dog training basics. I'd love to see you there, both of you." Margaret found herself nodding. "We'll be there." As she drove home, Grace snoring softly in the back seat, Margaret realized something profound had shifted inside her. The cottage on Mulberry Lane was still filled with memories of Robert. It always would be, but it was no longer a shrine to the past. It was becoming a home again, a place where new memories could form alongside the treasured old ones. The next few weeks took on a rhythm Margaret hadn't experienced in years. Mornings with Grace in the garden. Afternoons often spent volunteering at the animal shelter, where she discovered she had a knack for working with the shy, traumatized animals who reminded her of Grace in those early days. And sometimes, not every day but often enough to notice, conversations with Daniel, first about animals, then about books they'd both read, films they'd seen, places they'd visited. It was during one such conversation, while walking Grace and Daniel's shelter favorite, an elderly beagle named Winston, through the park, that Margaret found herself sharing stories about Robert. "He would have loved this dog-walking business," she said, watching Grace and Winston investigate a particularly interesting bush. "He used to say dogs make better company than most people. Sounds like a wise man," Daniel remarked. "Tell me more about him." And Margaret did, about Robert's terrible singing voice but persistent insistence on joining in with the radio, about his collection of hideous ties their children gave him each Father's Day, about his passion for crossword puzzles and inability to cook anything more complicated than toast. Stories she had kept locked inside because they hurt too much to share. "You must miss him terribly," Daniel said when she finally fell silent. "Every day," Margaret admitted, "but differently now. It's like he's moved from being an open wound to being a part of me I carry forward. Does that make any sense?" Daniel's smile was sad but understanding. "Perfect sense. After Claire died, my wife, I thought I'd never be able to speak her name without feeling like I was drowning. Now I find myself telling stories about her and actually smiling. This shared understanding, this belonging to a club no one would choose to join, created a bond between them that deepened with each conversation, each dog walk, each volunteer shift worked side by side. By the time autumn painted the town in russets and golds, Margaret realized Daniel had become an integral part of her new life. Not replacing Robert, never that, but creating something different, something valuable in its own right. It was Grace who orchestrated their first real date, in her own canine way. During a Sunday afternoon volunteer session at the shelter, the puppy, now a sleek young dog with boundless energy, had spotted a squirrel through the window and lunged, sending Margaret stumbling directly into Daniel's arms. For a moment, they froze in that unexpected embrace, Margaret's hands against his chest, his arms instinctively steadying her waist. Something electric passed between them, a recognition, a possibility. "I'm so sorry," Margaret stammered, stepping back. "I'm not," Daniel said simply. His directness startled a laugh from her. "Margaret," he continued, still holding her gaze, "would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? Not at Marino's with the volunteer crew, just you and me." The question hung between them, weighted with importance. This wasn't a casual after-event meal or a friendly dog-walking chat. This was a step into territory Margaret hadn't thought she'd ever explore again. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with surprising ease. "I'd like that very much." Their first date was not without awkwardness. Two people in their 60s, carrying decades of life experience and the shadows of great love and great loss, learning to navigate the strange waters of new romance. But beneath the initial nerves was a comfortable companionship, a shared understanding that made words sometimes unnecessary. As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship grew in small, careful increments. Dinners became regular occasions. Daniel joined Margaret and Grace for walks in the snow-covered park. They exchanged books, compared favorite films, discovered shared tastes in music and art. And on Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in Margaret's cottage with Grace dozing between them, Daniel took her hand. "I never expected this," he said softly. "After Claire, I thought that part of my life was over. I'd made peace with it even. And then Grace found a dying puppy," Margaret finished, squeezing his hand. Daniel smiled. "And the puppy found you and eventually led you to me. A regular Christmas miracle." Margaret looked around her cottage, the cottage that had once felt like a museum of grief, but now felt alive again. The Christmas tree in the corner, decorated with a mix of her old ornaments and new ones she and Daniel had chosen together. Grace's toys scattered across the floor. Daniel's reading glasses on the side table next to Robert's favorite chair, a chair that no longer felt sacrosanct, but simply well-loved. "Robert would have liked you," she said suddenly. "He always said I should never be alone if anything happened to him. I was so angry when he'd talk like that. I couldn't imagine a world without him in it. But he was right." Daniel's eyes were warm with understanding. Claire said something similar. "She made me promise I wouldn't mope around forever," as she put it. "I think they'd be pleased with us, don't you?" Margaret felt a sense of rightness settle over her. "I think they would." Later that night, after Daniel had gone home with plans to return for Christmas breakfast, Margaret sat with Grace in the bay window, watching snowflakes drift past the streetlights. The puppy, no longer a puppy really, but forever her puppy. In Margaret's heart, rested her head on Margaret's lap, warm and solid and real. "You know," Margaret whispered, stroking the silky ears, "when I found you that day, I thought I was saving your life. I never realized you were actually saving mine." Grace looked up with those soulful eyes, as if she'd understood every word, then settled back with a contented sigh. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white. A clean slate, a new beginning. Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Life had taken unexpected turns, bringing both devastating loss and surprising joy. And somehow, through it all, she had found her way to this moment of quiet contentment. A lonely widow had saved a dying puppy, never realizing it would later lead her to her soulmate. But perhaps more importantly, it had led her back to herself.